Okay, hi everyone. I'm Joel Finnis. I'm one of the two co-leads, soon to be three co-leads of the Coast and Ocean Risk Communication Community of Practice, a integrated group of practitioners, academics, and stakeholders who discuss issues around risk communication in the context of coastal and ocean environments. And this is a third, I believe, in our ongoing series of webinars around risk communication. We're very happy to have with us today Andrea Minano and Jason Thistlethwaite from the University of Waterloo, who'll be talking to us today about Canada's flood maps. Now, Andrea is a PhD candidate with the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. She's a specialist in geographic information systems. She's worked for municipal, provincial, and federal governments, as well as the insurance industry. Her current research is highly interdisciplinary. In the past, she's looked at the visualization of flood risk, community-based climate adaptation, and flood risk management policy. And her current focus really is on public and private responsibilities in flood risk management and identifying opportunities for strengthening flood resilience in Canada. Her co-presenter, Jason Thistlethwaite, is an associate professor at the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at Waterloo. And his research focuses on innovative strategies to reduce the economic impacts of extreme weather and climate change. He explores the role of insurance and government risk transfer in promoting climate change adaptation and reducing economic vulnerability. And in this work, he interacts directly with business and government leaders in the fields of insurance, banking, real estate, construction, and investment. Now, Jason is also a frequent speaker, media contributor, etc., on Canada's growing vulnerability to extreme weather. And frankly, I've noticed that he's been kept very busy between recent spring flooding around North America and ongoing discussions around carbon taxes, both by our national and international news sources. So yeah, it's a pleasure to have them here with us today. And just before I set them loose to give their presentation, I'll just point out that I'll be monitoring questions and I'll deliver them to the presenters once they've finished their talk. So if you'd like to ask anything, just send a note to the panelists or to myself, and I'll make sure that we read through them and get those addressed. So thanks so much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea and Jason.
Okay, thanks, Joel. And yeah, I realize that I'm going to have to improve my bio. Andrea's is so impressive. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. And thanks, it's a great opportunity to speak a little bit about this research that, oddly enough, every year in the spring, we tend to get an opportunity to have some attention directed towards some of this work. So we're always trying to be a little bit ahead of the curve and make sure that when we do get into flood season, that the media, but also our leaders, our elected officials are talking about the right things. So it was nice to see that this research got some attention lately, and that flood mapping was on some TV screens. I'm going to go into talk a little for a few minutes, just giving some the broad context of why we're doing this research and the so what around this work, and then Andrea's going to take over with the specifics on the study itself that we're going to talk to today. So why are we interested in flood risk? Well, it's by far Canada's most costly and common hazard. We're seeing that really for any number of reasons that the losses that we've experienced over the last, well, really 20 years, but definitely in the last decade or so, are no longer socially acceptable. There are a few important costs to talk about. We're seeing defenses come to the end of their lifespan, significant increases in disaster assistance costs. So this is the taxpayer-funded money that'll go out and help people recover from these floods. An example is that between 1996 and 2011, the annual cost was about $118 million a year, and it jumped to $280 million between 2012 and 2015, and since then has increased as well. And of course, there's a concern around legal liability, that the more we know about some of these risks, and the more that we see these losses occur, then we're going to have to start holding someone legally accountable. And we can talk a little bit later about some of those implications when it comes to mapping. So, unless you've been on some sort of social media diet or retreat from Canadian media, you'd have noticed that over the last few weeks that this firsthand we're seeing evidence of why flood risk is a peril or a hazard that's important to tackle. In Canada, we're no strangers to significant risk. The sort of the modern era of attention around this really started in 2013 with the Calgary and Toronto floods. People, as they are often to assume when it comes to some of these floods, the media goes around and says, well, we think this is a 1 in 50 year or a 1 in 100 year flood. And surely the next year, when you have a very similar flood in a very similar area, you start to question and start to think that something's not quite right. And that's exactly what we've seen between 2017 and 2019, with very similar areas in 2017 being affected by flooding as we're seeing today. And of course, Port New Brunswick last year and again this year with significant flooding. So it is a big problem in Canada that we're trying to tackle, and really the motivation for our team's research focus. Today, what we're going to start with is just a bit of an introduction on the history of the way we've done flood mapping in Canada. And then, as I mentioned, Andrea will take over and go into a bit of the study. And then we have some suggestions on some policy changes that we'd like to see based on the research that we've done. So let's get right into the history here. So it's nothing new that floods are Canada's most common and costly hazard, that they have so over time. So that's been quite a static development. What has been much more dynamic is the policy landscape. Like many of our counterparts, Canada began its emphasis on disaster management by thinking that it could very much build safety in and around our communities. We quickly recognized in the early post-war years that we had development in high-risk areas, and the only way that we were going to be able to protect people was by investments in structural works and structural infrastructure, so dams, dikes, reservoirs, and so on when it comes to flooding. In the 1970s, some evidence both here but also internationally that you can't simply assume that these structural works are going to work all the time, and that there is no such thing as absolute protection. And so here we now see, and we have improvements in technology, and so we see governments take a bit of a shift where we start to recognize that we need to start using information. We need to start doing stuff more before the flood occurs, as opposed to waiting, using structural defenses and waiting after. And it's during this period that we start to see some emphasis around the idea that we need to know where the flood risk is. And we need to also help people when the structural defenses fail. So this 1975 period to the 1990s sort of present is the real period where you have some growth around flood maps in Canada, but also increasing use of the disaster assistance program as a main means of recovery. At the end of the 1990s, and I'll talk about this in particular with the flood damage reduction program, you see a really significant shift in Canada where the federal government, for the most part, vacates a lot of the space around disaster management and flood risk management in particular, with the expectation that the provinces and municipalities would take on some more leadership. And what this has led to is the situation where we are today, where you have the federal government with a big pot of money really using programs like the National Disaster Mitigation Program to offer flood protection via a grant system that is passed on down through the provinces. And a recognition that we can no longer support continuing payments through disaster assistance, and we need to reduce the taxpayer burden across the country. And so in 2015, we have the introduction of flood insurance. And this is important because now with flood insurance available, you no longer qualify for disaster assistance. So very much we've seen the responsibility of different stakeholders below the federal government increase. So let's talk a little bit about really arguably what could be called sort of Canada's golden era in flood mapping. And this was spawned through a recognition that we needed to better protect our communities, and we needed to also know where we should be developing. This is very much at a time of big growth in Canada, significant growth and development and good economy. So we need to figure out areas where we need to limit development. And so what was initiated out of this is a really unique cost-sharing program between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to fund up-to-date flood maps. And the program was very successful. Over 900 communities gained access to maps, also saw the interaction between this information and land use planning to restrict some development in high-risk areas. And it's important to note that this program had the caveat, had the qualification that once these maps designated somewhere as high risk or at risk of flooding, the disaster assistance would not be made available in the event of a flood. And in the scholarship, as I mentioned, the FDRP is very much noted as sort of a significant really drive to get the foundation and infrastructure around what we now have in maps in Canada, and many jurisdictions in Canada still very much rely on these maps. Once the FDA, at the end of the 1990s, I mentioned that the federal government really started to recognize that well, for various reasons, but one of the big reasons is that they recognized that a lot of the mapping, while being available, wasn't having too much of an impact on development. And so it pulled back from its responsibility and cut funding for this program. The last funding went out in the year 2000. And what we've seen since then is very similar to what we've seen elsewhere in the world, and that's the adoption of what's known as risk-based policy to try and reduce disaster assistance. And there are a couple justifications for this, but broadly what it means is that responsibility for disaster management, flood risk management should be delegated to sort of the most local jurisdiction as you can, because these areas have the most exposure, but they also have the most knowledge, the most sort of local context to be able to better inform solutions. So some of the policy changes that you've seen to support this is new restrictions on disaster assistance. Of course, the emergence of flood insurance in Canada, giving responsibility to property owners to protect themselves, and various small-scale measures to encourage property-level flood protection. So responsibility in sort of this new era, the federal government has really taken a step back from this. And as I mentioned before, the National Disaster Mitigation Program is sort of another example of this. It is not prescriptive at all. This is Canada's main program to supporting initiatives, risk management, meaning policy and actions that try and reduce flood risk before it actually materializes, before the water exceeds its riverbanks. And why it's of note is that municipalities, the way it works is municipalities can put together a proposal, it'll go up to the province, and if the province greenlights it, it then becomes eligible for funding. There's a bunch of cost sharing involved in it, but it supports flood mapping. So municipalities now can so this is the first time we've seen, since the FDRP, some federal funding available for other governments to actually try and get some of this information, with the idea being that if we know where the risk is, we can then start to take some of these actions, be it mitigation or sort of investment in non-structural projects to reduce the risk. And so this is the visual representation of sort of our research team's understanding of where we are right now in flood risk management in Canada. So this is the model of how the system is supposed to work. And that you have a series, as you can see along the bottom, of different policies that are designed to absorb each a sort of a proportion of the risk. So different stakeholders adopt different strategies. Each of those are in a layer so that if one fails, that there's a backup. And where you see it's important to pay attention to the role of property owners here. And of course, risk communication, which is where the flood maps would fit into. Now, in an ideal system, of course, you have all of these different stakeholders and all of these different policies that they implement absorb a big chunk of this type of exposure. What we would argue that's happened in Canada is that some of these policies and stakeholders that you see that exist before the property owner aren't actually sufficient, organized, and coordinated. And so actually we've seen the responsibility of property owners increase relative to some of these other areas. And indeed our paper on flood risk mapping more or less supports that conclusion. A key part of this, as I keep mentioning, is that there's now a much more significant expectation on the part of our governments that individuals will take on more risk. They will know their risk. They will then, with this information, they will respond rationally and take actions to reduce that risk, both at the property level, but also at the community level. You know, once the government funding for bailouts or disaster assistance is taken away, municipalities will now, of course, have an incentive to limit development in high-risk areas and try and protect those areas already at high risk. And of course, a big part of this is that at the individual level is that now that you know you're not going to get bailed out by the government, that you should go out there and buy flood insurance. The problem in this strategy, and the one around that we've noted around flood risk management, is that because it places such a significant emphasis on both local agency, be it the individual or community, that it's contingent on a high level of flood risk awareness. And so we, in 2016 and 2017, we were curious about this and went out and surveyed over 2,300 Canadians. And of course, what we found was that a large portion of the population is not aware of flood risk. So in this slide here, the little bars, the third bar on the right for each province, that little, the lightest green color there, that's the number of respondents that got this question right. We asked only people that lived in high-risk areas whether they were concerned about flood risk, and big majority were not. So we're having responsibility shifted towards individuals in Canada through this adoption of sort of risk-based policy systems, but we don't have an awareness about risk. And so I'm going to turn it over to Andrea now, that's going to talk a little bit about how other governments have actually accommodated that transition towards risk management with some of their policies.
Yeah, so thank you, Jason, for that thorough review on flood management in Canada. So as Jason was mentioning, for throughout Canada's history, governments have been the leaders in managing flooding, whether it is, through structural works, through land use policy decisions, through flood mapping, etc. And now there's this increasing attention on the homeowner and on personal responsibility when it comes to flood risk. So in countries where they have adopted such an approach, there's different kinds of policy tools that are available. So for example, in England, they have these like national flood maps, but they also have flood wardens on the ground. So for example, this could be a person who had experienced flooding in their community before, and now they're teaching others around their neighborhood about flooding, what they should know and how to prepare. A similar strategy, or actually something kind of the same in similar lines, is in Germany they have a flood pass, so you can kind of get an assessment for your property. If you've experienced flooding in the past, this can actually tell you how you can reduce your risk, how you can adapt to flooding, and people can use that when they're selling their homes. So there's kind of these like solutions that are coming out, and that I think can serve as potential inspiration for Canada as well, as there continues to be more interest in this private side and citizen participation in flood risk management. So to give you kind of like a study context, and I guess some of the inspiration around our study, so we looked for flood maps that were publicly accessible online, and I took this stand as a regular Canadian. And I was very much inspired by stories that I had read in the media, and also like the one that you see on the screen now, but also conversations that I had with people who are actually climate change experts, and who, when Ottawa was flooding, they were also looking for flood maps for their communities, and they were also telling me about the challenges of finding information. So I wanted to quantify and understand where flood information is available, particularly flood maps. And if I'm a concerned Canadian seeing flooding in the media, and I look this up online, what do I find from my community? So because in Canada, a lot of our foundation in terms of flood management came from the Flood Damage Reduction Program, that's really the only list that we have that's publicly accessible to my knowledge of flood vulnerable communities across the country. And as Jason mentioned, there were 957 communities as identified by the FDRP in the 1970s as being flood prone. And so I wanted to we then created a sample of those communities and came up with 369 communities to have sort of a representative sample of flood vulnerable areas. to figure out, are flood maps available for these communities? What's interesting is that as I was kind of developing the research, I found out that many of those communities had amalgamated, and they were no longer called those names anymore, because this is 1970s, and so I had to match them with their present-day municipalities, and it ended up being 280 municipalities across Canada. So, as I mentioned, there is no centralized repository of flood maps in Canada, unlike other nations like the United States and England. So that kind of creates a very tricky landscape in terms of where do I find flood maps for communities in Ontario? Where do I find flood maps for communities in Nova Scotia? And so for each and every community in our study, we searched a lot of different sources. So we went through municipal websites, provincial websites. In Ontario, we're fortunate to have conservation authorities. We went to conservation authority websites. And then we also did regular Google searches. So for example, Calgary flood maps. And as we kept finding flood maps, we started to create a database of everything that we were finding, and to kind of create this like overarching view of what is available, and to figure out, where are flood maps not available online, where are they available online. And so just in terms of our methodology, this was done relatively recently in July 2018. So the criteria that we drew from to evaluate these maps was very much tailored through a literature review of risk communications literature. So I wanted to know, I didn't want a map that necessarily told me something very technical. I wanted something where normally when you share a flood map, people want to know, where's my house? That's basically the first question. So one of the criteria was, does this map show houses? Can you look up your address through this kind of like mapping portal? I wanted to know if it had local context. So can people kind of relate to what they're looking at? Do they see local features, roads, and things like that? Historical context has come up in risk communications literature too, like photographs, for example. Storytelling can be a big role in helping people understand flooding and putting it into their own sort of local experience. Something that for all the cartographers watching this, legend legibility, it's actually a funny criteria to have. You basically learn that in Mapping 101, clear legend, so that people can understand what they're looking at. And the same goes for flood zone legibility. Can you distinguish where the floodwaters are in relation to the rest of the map? Explanation of technical terms. I didn't want to see things like 100-year flood, because that's easily misunderstood by members of the public. Risk reduction advice. Can you figure out, after you see this flood map, what are the next steps, things that you can take, steps that you can take to protect your family and kind of cope with a situation in case you go through a flood. Transparency about flood modeling limitations and uncertainty. There's a typo there. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that because you're not on a regulatory floodplain that's the only place that can flood. There's many places outside of that regulatory flood line that can flood. So I wanted to see a little bit of transparency and to kind of be clear about that in some of the maps that I was looking at. And depiction of multiple flood hazards. So as Jason mentioned, we've seen things like urban flooding is a huge issue here in Ontario. And so I wanted to see maps that depicted riverine and pluvial flooding, which is pluvial flooding happens when there's overwhelmed sewers and that type of thing, and when water ends up getting into people's basements. So my evaluation framework, myself and another researcher whose background is in public policy, just to kind of be clear about who was all like looking for information here. We went through all of the websites, all of the maps, collected all the data, and then we evaluated each map according to the criteria that I just presented. So a map could receive a score up to 9 because we used sort of like a binary criteria. So if the legend was clear and it was legible, they got a 1. If it was not clear, they would get a 0. And just for the sake of the results and to kind of summarize everything, there were some communities that we found many maps for, sometimes like up to 20 maps. And so for the sake of our results, we just used the highest quality map. So whichever map got the highest score, that's what represented the whole community. Going to the more fun part, results. So we found flood maps for 85% of sample municipalities. I was expecting something quite high because we were looking for places that have been known to historically flood and have been part of, previous government programs. So that was great that we found so many maps and so much information is out there for so many different kinds of communities across the country. The not so great part is that they were really sometimes very difficult to find, and I will explain with visuals as to what some of the challenges were. So, for example, in Hamilton, Ontario, if you're not familiar with Hamilton actually encompasses 4 of those conservation authorities. So what you're looking at in that small map on the left, these are the conservation authority, sort of their jurisdiction. And Hamilton is a city that has a variety of conservation authorities. So I actually had to figure out, or if you're a citizen of Hamilton, you would have to figure out which conservation authority you kind of fall under, and then you would be able to find information for your area. So in the case of Hamilton, we found lots of different flood maps because they're published by different conservation authorities. So these are some of the examples of what these portals look like. Campbellton, BC. BC was an interesting one, especially going through the provincial government website, because a lot of them are the maps, how you would find them for our communities, and you sort of have to figure out where that community would fall and under which river, and then sort of look at that area. And then on the left-hand side there, you would see where Campbell, the link that says Campbell, and I think you say Quinsam Rivers. So you click that, then you get to the next one, which is step 2 there. And then we had to go in and click on Campbellton. And actually it took me a couple of times to figure out that you can actually click on step 2. So that was through some quality checking that we did. Halifax. In Halifax, it was a different kind of scenario where we went through lots of planning documents, and you can find some of the regulatory floodplains through their planning documents. But then there's also interesting initiatives that you find through other websites, like this coastal and sea level rise map produced by a research group out there. And so again, if you're a member of the public, you would have to figure out and to continue your search. Basically, I would not just be asking you, like, find a flood map. It's then, oh, keep looking, basically, because that flood map that you find only shows you one type of flooding, say river flooding. And then through another map, you would see your coastal flooding that you would find through a separate website. So the search kind of gets a bit kind of complicated as you continue on and as you keep trying to figure out where all this information is available. So in terms of quality, I'm just moving my notes here. Okay, so in terms of quality, 62% of flood maps scored 4 or less out of 9. As I mentioned, a lot of the criteria were very much focused on risk communication. There are other studies that have been done that particularly look at the age of flood maps in Canada with a median age of 18 years. But I was looking at, is it user-friendly? Is it accessible to somebody who may not really know all the technical jargon that comes with hydrology and all of that? And unfortunately, most of the flood maps are very much, technical drawings, and that's what you find right now. Less than 50% of municipalities had access to flood maps that, for example, would allow a resident to identify their property, or that really paired, okay, you're at risk, but what can you do about it? And, that kind of advice. And very few depicted more than one type of flooding. So just to give you an example of how we went about doing this quality checking and figuring out, what kinds of criteria each map has. This is an example of Calgary. If you can basically see where the floodwaters are, then that would get a 1. That's flood zone legibility. The same goes for limitations of flood modeling and local features. the same can't really be said about this map, which is something we found for a small town in BC. And I'm looking at it right now, and I still have a hard time figuring out where the floodwaters would go. So this is more or less of a summary of what it is that we found. And as I said, 50% of municipalities, you see there what kinds of the criteria were the most common. So for example, legibility of the legend and legibility of the flood zone. And most of the maps that we found were very much at a community level, but you couldn't really distinguish where individual properties were. And the same goes for the other criteria. So as I said, a lot of the maps are very much, in my opinion, they're very much directed at technical audiences. So in some ways, and how I kind of make sense of it all is that, well, in Canada, we have governments who were primarily responsible for flooding. So it makes sense, for example, a conservation authority communicating to a developer, you can't build here, here's our map that shows our regulatory floodplain. That makes complete sense to me, but we are, I think, missing an important piece here as governments continue to put attention on property owners to figure out what to do about flooding and be a part of flood risk reduction. One of the interesting bits is that I couldn't find, as I mentioned, pluvial flood risk. The majority of flood maps that we find in Canada are very much, floodplains, riverine floodplains, and yeah, you can't really figure out what are the next steps after you figure out your flood risk. So, kind of to summarize, although in most of the communities we were able to find flood maps, that wasn't the most easy process. There were a lot of things that between me and myself and another researchers we had to do to create our database. And I don't think we're leveraging flood maps in the best and most effective way to communicate flood risk. So I think that there are opportunities to improve the use of flood maps and to test them out with, real citizens and to figure out how they kind of want to receive information and what kinds of bits of information would be particularly important. I've come across recently with a woman who the municipal government basically dropped off sandbags in front of her house and told her to figure it out. So I think these are kind of programs that perhaps, using the flood warning strategy that I mentioned in England, that could be something that, members of the public can begin to help each other out. And, oops, let me go back there. Where is it? Okay, so it's not all bad news. There's been recent improvements that have happened. I just came across this example in Quebec before flood season, so April, May this year. They have updated their website. It includes actions that a person can do before, during, and after a flood. I think this is a step in the right direction. I am a huge fan of this portal in England. I think it's really quite incredible because they have, it's a portal that you can access at the national scale, so you can figure out if you're at risk of flooding for surface water flooding, which is pluvial flooding, for riverine flooding, for coastal flooding, and there's also flooding for reservoirs. And not only can you figure out if you're at risk of flooding, you can also figure out what to do. So it's not just like, this impossible task to create databases where you can have risk and your type of risk and tailor that with actions that a regular person can take. So in this case, sign up for flood warnings, learn about flood insurance. And something that I found out recently is that in England, they've tailored and revamped this whole website because they acknowledge the fact that there are younger members of the population who may not be as flood aware as older members of the population. So they are trying to target these younger demographics as well, and also transient population, so tenants. The other cool thing about that portal is that they have made another kind of interface for planners that have more of these like technical drawings, and they have this what is kind of interesting is that they also have areas that are benefited by flood defenses, which is something that I've never seen being done in Canada. And I think what's interesting is that they also came from somewhere. You know, everybody is kind of trying to learn how to do this well and continue to test it out. And I think if we have that ability to learn from our past mistakes and also leverage new technologies, then we can continue to create something that is useful and that is aligned with government interests. So I'm going to turn this back to Jason.
Yeah, so to just a couple slides to conclusions before, so we can skip to the questions. As Andrea mentioned, a large part of our research is informed by engaging with practitioners, decision makers, and so on. So we've got some perspective now through some engagement in some of the way the federal government, but also provincial governments are thinking about this problem, because they are concerned about the lack of publicly available flood risk maps. So these are some of the things that we commonly come across in these conversations that are more or less confirmed by our research as well. So some issues in trying to address flood risk mapping in the future in Canada. Of course, the big one are some of these political barriers. It took an Access to Information Act to get the City of Edmonton to release its flood risk maps, and I'd argue that that's very much a case that could be generalizable to some of the feelings around Canada towards mapping. There is a perception in Canada that the release of this information will have implications for property values and the liability associated with the depreciation in those property values. And to be quite frank, if the maps are to be effective, there should be some depreciation in those properties. But in the past, the federal government has overcome this by taking that leadership. The buck sort of stops with the insurer of last resort in this country, and that's the national government. You can only sue so many people before you get up to the federal government, and they can take some leadership and use some disclaimers and this can be done at any level, to try and resolve some of the liability around, well, this municipality has allowed development, now has done a map, and it's found that development is in a high risk flood area. You can absolve yourself of some of the legal responsibility there. And we do intend to actually do some more work as a sort of a next step around some of the legal implications of this information in Canada. Another significant challenge is there really is no prioritization around flood risk mapping in Canada. As I was mentioning, we had a period where this was a big deal. We had resources, money going into a federal provincial program to deal with some of this. And a part of this is that there's significant fragmentation among various federal organizations, also somewhat at the provincial level, who all have some piece of the data or some responsibility for a policy that the data may influence. So if information comes out, of course, on areas that are at high risk of flooding, Public Safety Canada, for instance, will have to deal with the implications for disaster assistance, where it's Natural Resources Canada that actually is the one doing the mapping. And we have this broader problem, which is a very interesting and emerging area of research that Andrea will be continuing on with. And that's really how best to use this information to make a difference in terms of a behavioral response, be it either you, at a minimum, sort of are aware that you live in a flood risk area, a medium, maybe you take some steps to protect your property, you buy flood insurance, and more optimistically, you actually get an understanding of some of the public policy that has led to your particular situation being at high risk of flooding, and you can start to ask governments to take account for some of those policy decisions. So we need to know more about when you just release this information in a visualization, or how it actually makes a difference to an individual, but not just an individual, policymakers, people who are making decisions. And so Andrea will be carrying forward on some part of that research. I'm sure she's happy to talk about it if there's any questions. What do we think should happen next? Well, we have to address this gap in flood risk maps in Canada. I mean, it's frankly absurd that a country like this, with the resources, expertise, and technology that we have, doesn't have similar maps to our OECD counterparts. It is somewhat ridiculous when you look at what can be done by just for instance, some US states have much better maps than most jurisdictions in Canada. So what we propose is sort of a flood damage reduction program 2.0, another cost-sharing agreement between the federal government and provincial governments to produce high-quality, publicly accessible flood risk maps. And a second proposal, of course, is let's think about, as Andrea mentioned, there are different target audiences to these maps. Let's think about how these maps should be delivered. In the UK, there's a map for planners, there's a map for the public. We can do that. So we can think about what audiences we want to make these maps be made for. And that way we improve their capacity to influence decision making. So we want to, so municipalities, they tend to be a little adverse to releasing some of this information. At times. Well, how do we make the case then that that mapping in the long run actually has clear benefits for decision making? And we also want to improve and better get some resources towards how we get that information into some systems we already have for decision making. Things like, you know, when you go and take a look at, if you want to buy a house, you go to MLS in Canada, right? Well, what is the best model? What is the best approach to get that information out there? You know, full transparency is good, but maybe you don't need that much information. There can be ways to package that information to leverage that market. And the same goes for things like mortgage lending as well. So that is the broad sweep of that paper and a little bit of background on our flood policy research group here at the University of Waterloo. Andrea and my contact information is up here on this slide. And we'd be happy if you frequented our community of practice, the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum, which is really why we're here today, to try and get this information and knowledge out to everyone listening. So thank you very much, and we're happy to take questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jason and Andrea. I guess what I'll do here is just remind you that if you have a question, you can just use the chat function here. There's if you don't see it on your screen automatically, if you move your cursor around, it should appear near the bottom. If you send it to all panelists, I'll be able to see it. Just a quick note as well, I forgot to mention this earlier, this is being recorded, and we'll put up a recording of this sometime in the near future. So if there's something on here that you want to access again, you'll be able to go back and check it out a second time. And with that, maybe I'll start asking some questions. And I'll start off with this first one. It sounds like you've addressed this a little bit, Jason and Andrea. You mentioned that we'd really like to make some of these things more publicly available. But there's a question here about how publicly available this stuff is right now. If somebody wants to take a look at these flood maps today, is there a better alternative to just recreating the work that Andrea has done? Is there any potential that you maybe centralize some of the information about where to find these things, or has somebody already done that?
So I can answer that. Yeah. So great question. Yeah, in the actual paper that we published, they asked for us to also share the database that we were using for our results. So that database is found. I can point you to the link to it after the webinar. But yeah, I mean, it's all out there, right? It's all public, and basically what I did was just get all the links that would, the web links that would match with the municipality, and that's what the database is.
But let's say you weren't involved in this webinar. Good luck.
Yeah, that doesn't sound too promising. But yeah, okay, that's a great resource then. So our next question then is, do we get a sense, can you give us a sense of what kinds of return periods people are reporting on these flood maps? Is there a range, or is it usually just 1 or 2?
Yeah, so it depends. You know, the kind of I guess the standard in terms of the flood damage reduction program is to use a 1 in 100 year flood. And so most of the flood maps, from memory, we're showing that, the 1 in 100 year flood. In Ontario, though, for example, some conservation authorities use historical floods like Hurricane Hazel, which is, I think, estimated to be a 1 in 350 or so. But it depends. It depends on where you're looking, and also I think it's in that Alberta portal that I showed you. There's that distinction between the flood fringe and the floodway, and so the floodway would be your 1 in 20, and then your flood fringe would be your 1 in 100. So again, if you are meticulous, like we were, you would probably be able to find more information on what you're looking at. But But I would like to step away from return periods for public communications. I just went to a risk communication workshop a couple of weeks ago, and there's been some interesting research on why not to use 100-year flood and why to use perhaps high risk instead. And that's, for example, what they're using in England in that portal that I showed you. There's a distinction between high risk, medium, and low risk.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's the language shift I was going to ask about as well. If we're not using 1 in 100 year, that's the one we should use. So just turn it into a couple of different risk categories. Okay.
But it's all up for testing, you know, like this is kind of something that I'm interested in. It's like to test it out with like people, like real Canadians, that instead of just like us, like flood nerds, I would love to just test it out with real people to see, you know, what their reaction is.
So you did show a lot of flood risk maps from a bunch of different sources, and there's a question here about concerns around conflicting information. So if you've got government agencies, if you've got non-government agencies, and maybe they're taking a look at flood mapping at various different times, do you ever bump into conflicting information? Say, for example, different floodplains represented for the same river? And if so, are there any implications here for insurance or property owners?
That's a really interesting question because it's actually something that I dwell with a little bit. At the university, we've been, you know, fortunate to get access to some of these insurance flood maps. And yeah, sometimes there are differences with what governments have access to and are using. And I'm kind of like in the middle of exploring that. Like I can't tell you right now like what are the implications of the differences in information. But what I do know is that at least in terms of the flood maps that I find from government, as I said, they're very much like riverine flood focused. I would like to see a bit more of this like urban flooding being depicted on these maps because you know, basement flooding, according to insurance companies, it can be $43,000 in damages. So that's a significant figure that if you don't have any kind of protection there, you know, that's a tough one to kind of recover from.
Yeah, I mean, Glenn McGilvery, a good colleague at the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction in Media last week, described the state of flood risk maps as a dog's breakfast, and I think that's actually a great analogy to think about it. But the conflicts between them in Canada, I think one of the big ones is that actually most of our best flood risk information in the country is private. It's being held by insurers. It's being held by people with all the various data that you need to fill in on those flood maps, be it the value of properties, and that's really anomalous relative to our counterparts in other jurisdictions, and a justification for having the big government, the federal government, standardize it all and to make sure that it is comparable.
Excellent. So okay, the next question then, and this maybe ties into some of the other discussions we've been having, but there's a question here about what is the best way to encourage various governments at different levels to move towards opening the state up and making it as available as possible, to move this out of the hands of what is often the private industry to something that is publicly accessible. I know it's a recommendation you have, but I guess the question is, how do we end up pushing for this to happen?
You know, it's interesting because I think we are doing it a little bit here right now because we're continuing to talk about it. And for example, Jason and I did some media the last couple of weeks, and that's when the political attention is happening around flooding. So I think taking those opportunities, sometimes it takes those bad floods, and I hate to say it, to kind of push messages to get governments to understand that there are better ways of going about it. And I think that sometimes because sometimes floods, you know, they may have only attention for say 6 months or 4 months, no like significant change happens. For example, a couple of years ago when Ottawa flooded in 2017, there was this national roundtable. We've seen some action happening at the federal government level, and there are discussions like that are ongoing. I would like to see more, and I am a little like afraid that now that we don't know how the election is going to go in later on this year, and that's maybe some of those committees may no longer exist. So
I would say I give you the how change, the holy grail, that the answer to this one. But I give you an optimistic and I can give you a pessimistic. The optimistic one is that, so we've recently done some research around the sort of the public discourse around the Calgary and Toronto floods in 2013. And the narratives that we saw after those floods were very much focused around, we need to get people back. We need to help them recover. We need to ensure that their quality of life is not going to be harmed by these acts of God, these natural events. And we need to do everything we can to do that as governments. And of course, what that doesn't actually talk about there is what caused the flooding and what are actually the solutions to the flooding. And so we haven't tested this, whether the narrative has conclusively changed, but certainly over the last, seeing headlines about the quality of flood risk maps being on the news and these things, and the media starting to ask many more questions about it. How can I find this type of information? I think that is optimistic. Quebec's 24-point action plan commits significant funding, or at least more funding than we've normally seen, to flood mapping. So that right there is Quebec's doing it, why can't you do it? Which actually tends to be a much big, why does any government do anything in Canada? And it, rarely is it evidence-based. It's because someone else has done it and they look bad for not doing it. So I think that's some of the optimistic reasons why we could see an approach. And the federal government has committed to open data as a concept. So it fits within some of the senior people there's narrative of what they ought to be doing. Pessimistically, you need a few more years of what we've seen this year.
Okay. So yeah, they just capitalizing on those actual events and interprovincial or intergovernmental rivalry.
Canada.
So we have a question here as well about the practical potential value of what they're calling dynamic flood simulation maps, something that actually animates, perhaps, in terms of just communicating some of this flood risk or capturing some attention and maybe changing public behavior. Did you bump into anything along those lines?
No, because I wasn't looking at, there's some really cool things happening in the States, like at the Weather Channel using augmented reality and that type of thing. That doesn't fall under the definition that I use for our study. It's certainly something that, visually, as someone who studies flooding, to me, I'm amazed by the technology, and I would like to test that out with people to see that it actually influence that type of behavior, in terms of for people who were wanting to, or that they were targeting to evacuate, basically, because that was used during a hurricane in the last year or so, and they were using that to get people to evacuate and to know okay, take this seriously, right? And as I said, for me, looking at it, incredible. Someone in that position who is in the verge of should I evacuate or not? It depends, because a lot of people end up staying back because of personal reasons. A sick family member, multiple pets, they don't know what to do with them. So it goes beyond visualization. Let's put it that way. But I do think that it's something that is worth exploring, because flood maps can serve to start a discussion. And it's actually something that I'm doing for my PhD. It's exploring more of this virtual reality and augmented reality technologies.
So we have another question here, which I think speaks to some of your respective interests. There's a question here about shifting financial responsibilities, and the case of a particular island in Scotland is brought up, where the island itself is being classed as vulnerable to flooding, and insurers are being told by the Scottish Environment Protection Agency that they should not be using this information in setting premiums, but it seems they are. And at the same time, property owners are sort of just trying to pretend that this isn't happening, practicing what is referred to here in the question as a head in the sand tactic, because affording flood insurance is it's just too costly. So I wonder if you bump into some of these discussions as well when you're looking at these maps. How are the maps influencing some of the financial concerns that homeowners have, that communities have?
Well, I think that they are, because right now in Canada, who has this information is the insurance industry. So if you were someone who was concerned about this risk, you then go out and see if you can get fine insurance. And to your surprise, you may find that you actually can't afford it, or it isn't available. Now, whether or not, from my perspective, is sort of watching this space for seeing how it's evolved. This is very much akin to the privatization of risk. The governments have sort of shed their responsibility for it and have dumped it onto insurers who are going to privately make these decisions without our knowledge, and property owners who are more or less expected to then buy insurance, or if they can't get insurance, well, then there's your incentive to change your property. When we know from things like behavioral economics is that, and our survey that we did, where we asked Canadians of what, if they are interested in any of these things, even if they know about the risk. And we find what is really consistent in the literature. Individuals are not good flood managers. So, one of our big questions for our community of practice, but also our research in general, is who should be responsible for flood risk, and should individuals, how much responsibility should individuals have, given just the scale and scope of the challenge they face.
Perfect. Okay, maybe I'll finish off with one last question, then I'll make a quick pitch for some future opportunities and remind people where they can find this stuff later on. But there is a question here about how often this information should be updated, especially given that we're seeing that, say, for example, the 100-year storm is shifting quite a bit in response to recent precipitation events and extreme events.
Yeah, so I've come across some interesting tidbits of information on this. The other day, I came across a report by the British Columbia Real Estate Association, and I think it might have been the study had been commissioned by an expert, but on there it says every 10 years. So basically, the maps that we should be finding should be should have been created during this century. And in the European directive, they recommend every 5 years. So, I mean, maybe in some cases, they should be updated that frequently. Maybe in other cases, every 10 years. But it is my understanding that, at least 10 years.
How often did you find maps that were actually created within this current century?
A lot of the maps I found, for example, even in Newfoundland, for example, some of the maps there, although there are newer maps, some of the there are still some maps that you can find from the flood damage reduction program. But there have been studies, like as Jason was mentioning, with the NDMP, the National Disaster Mitigation Program. There has been funding that has been given to different entities across the country. Not exactly sure where explicitly that money was given for updating flood maps, but it is my understanding that there are updates happening. I would just like to know more specifically where, because I still find a lot of maps that were created during the flood damage reduction program. So many maps created during the 80s, maybe mid 90s, some in the 70s, and a lot of them, as I showed you, a lot of them technical drawings that were probably made for engineers at the time.
FEMA spends $300 million a year on its mapping. Much bigger country, much bigger economy, a lot more situations at risk. It's not pocket change. It'd be far less in Canada, but we have so much technology. I mean, there's no excuse not to keep up your maps up to date as much as you can.
Perfect. All right. So with that, I'll end by just quickly pointing out that one of our participants today and a co-lead for the Coast and Ocean Risk Communication Community of Practice, Ron Pelot, has posted a link to an upcoming Grand Forum in Quebec. It's on June 4th and 5th, dealing with coastal community resilience, and certainly coastal flooding is an issue they want to be discussing there. So if this is of interest, there's a link in the chat here that should be viewable by attendees. Aside from that, I'd just like to again thank Andrea and Jason for their excellent presentation. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for coming along. If you want to find recording of this in the near future, again, it'll be locatable through our website, corc cop.com, or our Future Earth site. And of course, there's a link here as well to the complementary community of practice, the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum, if you're looking to join further discussions about this kind of material with Andrea and Jason. Thanks so much.